I wasn't supposed to be home that early. The meeting ended ahead of schedule, and for once, I felt like I had the rest of the day to myself. I drove home with the windows down, letting the warm breeze cut through the tension of a long week. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Jack's car parked across the street. Nothing unusual. Jack was my best friend, practically family. He'd been over countless times, grabbing beers or watching games together. But today, seeing his car there felt off, like an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite scratch. I stepped inside quietly, expecting the usual, maybe Jack and Katherine chatting in the kitchen or watching TV. Instead, the house was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of muffled voices coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened as I moved through the hall, each step slower than the last, dread creeping up my spine. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see Katherine, my Katherine. She was with Jack, their bodies tangled in sheets that still smelled like us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and angry. For a moment I stood frozen, the scene in front of me burning itself into my mind. It was as if the floor had dropped out from under me, leaving me weightless, hanging in the thick air of betrayal. But they didn't see me, they didn't hear me, too caught up in their own world to notice the man they were destroying just a few feet away. My instinct was to burst in, to shout, to break things, to tear them apart like they had just torn me. But I didn't. Instead, I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, and left the house as quietly as I had entered. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, the image of them replaying in my mind on an endless loop. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to erase what I'd just seen, but all I could do was sit there, numb, staring blankly at the dashboard. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, mingling with heartbreak and a sickening sense of humiliation. Jack wasn't just a friend, he was the closest thing I had to a brother, and Katherine, she was my everything. Or at least, she had been. The next few days passed in a blur. I avoided them both, made excuses and dodged calls. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do, but my mind was a tangled mess of rage and despair. I drowned myself in work during the day and whiskey at night, hoping the alcohol would numb the pain. It didn't. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in my own misery, stewing in betrayal. Something had to change. I needed to understand why this had happened. Not just the surface-level excuses, but the real reasons that had led Katherine and Jack to betray me. I needed answers, not just for closure but to make sure this never happened to me again. That's when I found myself diving into psychology, spending hours reading books and watching videos, trying to decode the twisted dynamics of relationships. It started as a way to distract myself, but soon, I was hooked. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was gaining control over my own pain. I wasn't just some passive victim anymore. I was arming myself with knowledge. And with every new insight I felt a little bit stronger, a little less broken, but the anger never fully went away. It lingered, simmering under the surface, waiting for an outlet. I kept thinking about Katherine and Jack, how happy they looked, how easily they'd tossed me aside. I wanted them to feel what I was feeling. I wanted them to understand what they'd done, not through angry words or confrontation, but by tearing apart the very thing they thought they had. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make them pay. Not in the way they'd expect, but slowly, quietly. I was going to get inside their heads and make sure they unraveled the same way I had. They'd never see it coming, and when they did, it would be too late. Days turned into weeks, and the initial shock of what I'd seen that afternoon began to dull into something colder, more calculated. My life was now split into two distinct parts, the man I used to be and the man I was becoming. The old Nate, the one who trusted too easily, who believed in loyalty and love, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone with a sharp focus and a relentless drive to understand the human mind, especially the darkest corners of it. I threw myself into studying psychology like my life depended on it. Nights were spent reading case studies and dissecting the complexities of relationships, trust, and betrayal. I attended workshops, enrolled in courses, and shadowed therapists who specialized in marriage counseling. The more I learned, the more I realized how fragile and easily manipulated human connections were. What happened to me wasn't just bad luck or a fluke. It was a web of predictable patterns, and I was determined to master every thread. The knowledge empowered me. It was like a shield against the pain that still gnawed at my insides. I didn't just want to heal, I wanted control. Control over my emotions, my future, and most importantly, over the people who had wronged me. I started consulting part-time, offering advice to couples on the brink, all while testing the theories and tactics I'd learned. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, watching people unravel their issues while I sat there, perfectly composed, secretly dissecting their every move. Then one day, fate handed me the perfect opportunity. I was asked to speak at a weekend seminar on relationship dynamics, a chance to showcase my newfound expertise. As I scanned the crowd during my introduction, my heart skipped a beat. There in the third row were Katherine and Jack. They were sitting together, hands intertwined, looking like the perfect couple. My stomach churned at the sight of them, but I kept my expression neutral, hiding the rush of anger beneath a practiced smile. They hadn't noticed me yet. Or why would they? I was just a name on a program, another speaker in a long lineup. But as I began my presentation, their eyes found mine, and I saw the flicker of recognition wash over their faces. Katherine's mouth opened slightly in shock, and Jack's grip on her hand tightened. They tried to play it cool, but I could see the unease settling in. They hadn't expected me to be here, standing before them, with an authority and confidence they never knew I had. I took a deep breath and continued, addressing the room but speaking directly to them in my mind. I talked about the psychology of trust, how it's built, and how easily it can be destroyed. I watched Katherine shift uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting between me and Jack. He sat rigid, pretending to take notes, but his eyes were glazed over with a mix of guilt and defiance. After the session, Katherine approached me, her expression a mix of confusion and forced politeness. "Nate," she said, her voice tinged with an awkward familiarity, "I didn't know you were doing this now." I smiled, a calm, measured smile that I'd practiced in the mirror 100 times. "Life takes you in unexpected directions," I replied, enjoying the subtle tension in her posture. Jack hung back, avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Good. Let him squirm. What you said up there was interesting," Katherine continued, struggling to find the right words. "You've really changed." "Yeah," I said, locking eyes with her. "I guess we all have." We exchanged a few more pleasantries before they left, but I could feel the undercurrent of unease between them. I'd planted the first seeds of doubt. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the following weeks, I began subtly inserting myself into their lives. I wasn't overt, I didn't need to be. A casual email to Jack, a friendly check-in with Katherine about the seminar, just enough to remind them that I was still there, still watching. I wasn't the Nate they once knew. I was someone different now, someone who could see right through them. I'd offer advice masked as concern, feeding into their insecurities and gently pushing them toward conflict. If Katherine complained about something small, I'd amplify it, making it seem like a bigger issue than it was. With Jack, I played on his guilt, subtly suggesting that maybe he wasn't giving enough to the relationship. It was all so easy, too easy even. They were falling apart right before my eyes, and all I had to do was give them a little nudge. Every time I saw them together, it was as if they were carrying the weight of my betrayal with them, a constant reminder of their own flaws and weaknesses. The trust between them, once so solid, began to crack. They argued more, over small things at first, but then about bigger issues, jealousies, doubts, and old insecurities that had been buried but never forgotten. I watched from the sidelines, invisible but always present, savoring the quiet chaos I was creating. I thought I'd feel satisfied, vindicated even, but there was something else, an emptiness that grew with every fight, every tear I caused. It was a hollow kind of victory, one that tasted bitter no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I thought watching them fall apart would be enough. That seeing Jack and Katherine unravel under the weight of their own insecurities would finally give me the satisfaction I craved. But as the weeks went on, I realized that their misery wasn't the cure I'd hoped it would be. The hollowness inside me remained, lingering like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Yet, I kept pushing. It was too late to turn back now. I continued to play the role of the concerned friend, the mentor, and the guide. On the surface, I was helpful and understanding, but every piece of advice I gave was designed to wedge them further apart. Katherine called me one afternoon, her voice trembling with frustration. She vented about how distant Jack had become, how he seemed more interested in his work than in her. I listened patiently, offering sympathetic noises at just the right moments. "You know, Katherine," I said, keeping my tone casual, "sometimes people pull away when they feel guilty. It's easier to bury themselves in work than face their own mistakes." I let the words hang in the air, knowing they would fester in her mind long after our conversation ended. Katherine was silent for a moment, absorbing my insinuation. "Do you really think that's what's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, but it's worth thinking about," I replied, my voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "Relationships can be tricky, especially when there are unresolved issues." I hung up, picturing her sitting alone, replaying every argument, every moment of doubt. The cracks were widening. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on Jack. He was always harder to read, but I knew how to get under his skin. During one of our infrequent meetups, I brought up the topic of trust. I framed it as an innocent question about my work, but it was aimed squarely at his conscience. "Do you ever think about how easily trust can be broken?" I asked, stirring my coffee as if the question were an afterthought. Jack looked up, his eyes flickering with discomfort. "Yeah, I guess," he mumbled, clearly not in the mood to delve into the topic. But I didn't let it drop. "It's interesting," I continued, "how sometimes the people who seem closest to us are the ones we know the least about. We think we're safe, but all it takes is one mistake, one secret, and everything changes." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. He knew what I was doing, even if he couldn't admit it. He was trapped, just like I'd been, and the walls were closing in. Over the next few weeks, I kept feeding them bits and pieces of carefully crafted doubt. I'd plant subtle suggestions, play on their fears, and then step back to watch the fallout. Katherine's insecurities flared up like never before. She accused Jack of things he hadn't done, projecting her own guilt onto him. Jack, on the other hand, withdrew further, wrapping himself in a cocoon of work and excuses, too ashamed to confront what was happening. One evening, Katherine called me, her voice edged with desperation. "Nate, I don't know what to do anymore. Jack and we're not the same. We fight all the time and I don't even know what we're fighting about half the time." She sounded exhausted, worn down by the constant tension. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered the image of them together, laughing in a bed that was once mine, and the pity evaporated. "You both need to be honest," I said, delivering the advice as though I genuinely cared. "If you keep pretending everything is fine, it's only going to get worse." Katherine sighed. "I thought we could get through anything, but now, I don't even know if he loves me anymore." I paused, pretending to consider my response. "Love isn't always enough," I finally said. "Sometimes trust is more important. Without it, everything else falls apart." The silence on the other end told me I'd hit my mark. She thanked me and hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at my phone, wondering how I'd become this person, someone who could so easily twist the knife in those who had wronged him. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but it was like I couldn't stop. I was addicted to the control, to the feeling of being the puppet master in a game they didn't even know they were playing. One night I decided to see the damage for myself. I found them at a local bar, arguing in hushed but heated tones. Katherine's eyes were red-rimmed, her mascara slightly smudged, while Jack looked worn and defeated, nursing a drink like it was his lifeline. They were a far cry from the happy couple they once pretended to be. I watched from a distance, unseen, as the argument escalated. Katherine's voice rose, sharp and angry, while Jack sat there, a mix of guilt and frustration plastered across his face. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. Their body language said it all, the distance between them, the tension in their shoulders, the lack of any genuine connection. They were falling apart, piece by piece, and I was the invisible hand pulling the strings. But as I watched them, the thrill of victory I'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, all I felt was a strange emptiness, a gnawing realization that destroying them wouldn't fix what was broken inside me. It was a hollow, fleeting satisfaction that faded as quickly as it came. I left the bar that night, the sounds of their argument fading into the background as I walked away. The path I'd chosen was clear, but the destination seemed less certain with each passing day. For the first time, I began to wonder if this vendetta was worth it, or if I was just dragging myself down with them, stuck in the same cycle of bitterness and pain. I thought I'd found my purpose, my reason to keep going. But now, with Katherine and Jack on the brink of collapse, I couldn't help but ask myself, when this is all over, what will I have left? The morning air was crisp as I sat in my office, staring blankly at my laptop. I'd been up most of the night, my mind restless, replaying every conversation I'd had with Katherine and Jack. They were crumbling exactly as I had planned, yet the satisfaction I craved remained elusive. Instead, there was just a nagging emptiness that grew louder with each passing day. I had another seminar scheduled that afternoon, a talk on rebuilding trust in relationships. Ironically, it was one of my most requested topics. I couldn't help but smirk at the thought. Here I was, the expert on trust, secretly tearing apart the lives of two people who had betrayed mine. The hypocrisy of it was almost comical, but it was also becoming unbearable. As I prepared my notes, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Katherine. "Can we meet? I really need to talk." She'd been reaching out more frequently, each message more desperate than the last. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her stew in the mess I'd created, but the other part, the part still craving some semblance of control, couldn't resist. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place far enough from prying eyes. Katherine looked worse than I'd ever seen her. Her usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a fragile, almost broken version of the woman I used to know. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know what to do anymore, Nate," she said, her voice cracking. "Jack and I, it's like we're just going through the motions. Every day feels like a fight, even when we're not arguing. It's just empty." I leaned back, pretending to be thoughtful. "Relationships can be like that," I said carefully, "especially when there's unresolved pain. It eats away at everything good until there's nothing left." Katherine nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I feel like I'm losing him, and maybe it's my fault." Her admission hung in the air, raw and honest. For a moment I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly buried it. "You've both made mistakes," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But it's not just about blame, it's about whether you still want to fight for what you had." She looked at me, searching for something, maybe guidance, maybe forgiveness. "Do you think it's even possible to fix this?" I hesitated, the urge to continue my manipulation warring with something deeper. This was my chance to push her over the edge, to make her doubt everything about her relationship with Jack. But as I stared into her tear-filled eyes, I realized I didn't have the energy to keep playing this game. "It's possible," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. "But you have to be honest with each other. If you keep hiding, it'll only get worse." Katherine blinked, surprised by the sincerity in my words. I'd spent months tearing them apart, but now, in this small, unguarded moment, I couldn't bring myself to twist the knife any further. Maybe I was tired, or maybe I was starting to see the futility of it all. Either way, I was done. Katherine left with a quiet thank you, and I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of regret and relief. This wasn't how I'd pictured it ending. I wanted them to suffer, to pay for what they'd done, but instead, all I felt was the weight of my own bitterness pressing down on me. I decided to skip the seminar that afternoon. Instead, I went for a long drive, winding through roads I hadn't traveled in years. I needed to clear my head, to think about what was next. The truth was, I had no idea. For months, revenge had been my guiding star, but now that it was within reach, it felt hollow, like chasing smoke. The next day, Jack called me. His voice was tense, strained with the weariness of sleepless nights and constant arguments. "Nate, we need to talk," he said. There was no anger, just a resigned acceptance that things were spiraling out of control. We met at a bar downtown, the kind of place we used to hang out before everything went to hell. Jack looked like he'd aged 10 years since the last time we'd spoken face to face. He sat down heavily, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache that had been there for days. "I'm losing her," he said bluntly, staring into his drink. "Katherine and we're not working, and I don't know how to fix it." For the first time, I saw Jack not as the man who'd betrayed me, but as someone just as lost as I was. He wasn't some villain in my story, he was just human, flawed and stumbling through his own mess. I wanted to hate him, but all I felt was exhaustion. "You both need to stop punishing each other," I said, surprising even myself with the honesty in my voice. "If you keep dragging the past into the present, it's never going to get better." Jack glanced at me, his eyes weary. "I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you too. I'm sorry, Nate. For everything." It wasn't the apology I'd expected, and it hit me harder than I thought it would. All this time I'd been chasing some idea of justice, but now, face to face with Jack's remorse, it all seemed so pointless. What was I even trying to prove? That I could hurt them like they'd hurt me? That I could play God with their lives and come out feeling whole? Jack's apology wasn't just words, it was a mirror, reflecting back all the anger, bitterness, and emptiness that had consumed me. And in that reflection, I saw how much of myself I'd lost in the process. We sat there in silence for a long time, two men broken in different ways but sharing the same shattered space. The need for revenge, the urge to control, it all felt so small now, so inconsequential. I didn't have the answers and I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing: this cycle of pain had to end. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a strange sense of release. I was done playing games, done trying to manipulate lives that were already in pieces. Katherine and Jack would have to find their own way, just as I needed to find mine. It was time to let go of the past and start searching for something real, something that didn't come wrapped in anger or wrapped in revenge. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift, if only just a little. I didn't know where this new path would lead, but at least it was mine to walk, free of the ghosts I'd been carrying for far too long. The days after my meeting with Jack felt strangely light, like a storm had finally passed. I had expected to feel emptier, more aimless without the fuel of revenge driving me, but instead, there was a tentative sense of peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something closer to calm, a quiet acceptance that maybe I didn't need to carry the weight of all that anger anymore. I kept my distance from Katherine and Jack, letting them navigate their own mess without my interference. For the first time in months, I focused on my own life, throwing myself into work with a new sense of purpose. I started to truly help my clients, not just as a means of distraction or control, but because I genuinely wanted to see them succeed where I had failed. It was ironic, really, that in helping others fix their broken relationships, I was slowly piecing myself back together. But just when I thought I was out of the woods, Katherine showed up at my office unannounced. She looked fragile, almost translucent, like the weight of everything had finally worn her down to the bone. There was no anger in her eyes, just a deep, unspoken sadness that I hadn't seen before. "Nate," she said softly, stepping inside, "I need to talk to you." I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. I had a feeling this conversation was coming, but I still wasn't sure I was ready for it. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with all the things left unsaid. Finally, she took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "Jack and we've decided to separate," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the floor. "It's not working, and I think we both know it's over." I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and something like regret. This was the outcome I'd been pushing them toward, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like the victory I'd imagined. It was just sad. "I'm sorry, Katherine," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't just saying it to be polite. There was no joy in seeing her like this, no satisfaction in the fallout I'd helped create. "I don't know when things got so bad," she continued, her voice cracking. "It's like one day we were fine and the next, everything was broken. I've been trying to figure out what went wrong, and all I can think is, maybe we were never right to begin with." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't just one thing, that it was 1,000 little choices that led them here, some theirs and some mine. But I kept my mouth shut, letting her find her own answers. "I don't blame you for anything, Nate," she said, surprising me. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I really am, but all this, it's not your fault. We were broken long before you knew." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was more closure than I'd expected, but it was also a reminder that some wounds run too deep for apologies to heal. Katherine left soon after, and as the door clicked shut behind her, I felt a sense of finality. Whatever twisted cycle we'd been caught in was finally over. The next few weeks passed quietly. I saw less of Katherine and Jack, catching occasional glimpses of their lives moving forward in different directions. Katherine found a new job in a different city, and Jack stayed behind, diving into his work. They were trying to rebuild, each in their own way, and I was doing the same. One afternoon, I got a call from my old psychology professor, Dr. Miller, who had heard about my recent work as a consultant. He invited me to co-host a series of workshops on emotional resilience and relationship recovery. It was a chance to use everything I'd learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and turn it into something positive. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to step back into the world that had brought me so much pain. But as I thought about it, I realized this was my chance to start over, not just as a therapist but as a man who had seen the worst in himself and was ready to be better. The first workshop was packed, filled with couples at their breaking points, singles still reeling from heartbreak, and people just trying to make sense of their lives. I stood at the front, scanning the crowd, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of my past self in every weary face. They were all looking for answers, for some kind of roadmap through the chaos of human connection. I couldn't give them all the answers, but I could at least offer them hope. As I spoke about forgiveness, trust, and the messy, imperfect nature of love, I found myself letting go of the last remnants of bitterness that had clung to me. I shared stories, some from my own life, carefully edited to protect the guilty, and I watched as people nodded along, recognizing parts of themselves in my words. After the workshop, a young woman approached me, her eyes filled with the kind of pain that was all too familiar. "Your talk really helped," she said, her voice wavering. "I've been struggling with my own breakup, and hearing your story, it made me feel less alone." I smiled genuinely this time. "You're not alone," I said. "None of us are. We're all just trying to figure it out, one mistake at a time." As I left the venue, I realized that the journey I'd started, the one fueled by anger and betrayal, had led me somewhere unexpected. I hadn't found closure in revenge or satisfaction in manipulation, but I'd found something else, the strength to let go and the courage to move forward. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't need to. For the first time, I was okay with the uncertainty. I was done with the past, done with the games, and ready to build something new, not out of spite or regret, but out of the simple desire to be better than I'd been. As I drove home, the sun setting in the distance, I felt a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping kind of hope that movies are made of, but it was real, and it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Months had passed since I last saw Katherine and Jack. The chaos that once defined my life had settled into a quiet routine, one that I was finally starting to appreciate. I'd moved into a new apartment on the outskirts of the city, a modest place with just enough space to feel like a fresh start. The walls were still bare and the furniture mismatched, but it was mine, a blank slate, unburdened by the memories of the past. My work as a relationship consultant had taken off in ways I hadn't expected. The workshops with Dr. Miller were gaining traction, and I'd been invited to speak at several conferences about overcoming betrayal and rebuilding trust. I didn't sugarcoat my story, I told it honestly, sharing the mistakes I'd made and the lessons I'd learned the hard way. To my surprise, people responded to that honesty. I wasn't the perfect therapist with all the answers, I was just a guy who had been through hell and come out the other side still standing. It was during one of these conferences that I met Allison. She was attending with a friend, sitting in the back of the room, listening intently as I spoke about the importance of letting go of resentment. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple blue dress that made her stand out in the sea of business suits. There was a quiet confidence about her that caught my attention, and after the session she approached me. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, smiling warmly. "Your story, it hit close to home. I've been struggling to move on from a lot of things, and hearing someone else's perspective really helped." We ended up talking for hours after the conference, sharing stories about our pasts, our mistakes, and the awkward winding paths that had led us to where we were. Allison was a photographer, recently divorced, and still figuring out what her life looked like without the weight of her old relationship holding her back. There was a familiarity in her journey that resonated with me. She was rebuilding, just like I was. We started seeing each other more frequently after that. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or some dramatic all-consuming affair. It was slow, easy, and real. We went on walks, talked about our dreams and fears, and learned to appreciate the small, unremarkable moments that made up our days. It was the kind of relationship I hadn't realized I needed, honest, unforced, and rooted in the understanding that we were both just trying to be better than we were yesterday. One evening, a few months into our relationship, Allison invited me to one of her photography exhibits. The gallery was filled with her work, stunning black and white images that captured life in all its raw, imperfect beauty. As I walked through the room, I felt a sense of pride for her, and also a quiet realization that maybe I'd finally found someone who understood me in ways I hadn't expected. Allison joined me, holding 2 glasses of wine. "What do you think?" she asked, glancing at her photos with a mix of nerves and excitement. "They're incredible," I said honestly. "You have a way of seeing the world that's different, real." She smiled, her eyes meeting mine. "That's the goal, right? To find the beauty in the mess." We spent the rest of the night talking about our futures, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the quiet, tentative way people do when they're still learning to trust again. For the first time, I felt like I could see a path forward that didn't involve the ghosts of Katherine and Jack, or the bitterness that had once driven me. It was just us, 2 people trying to make something good out of what was left. A few days later, I received an unexpected email from Katherine. It was short, polite, and to the point, an invitation to lunch, to catch up if you're up for it. I hesitated, unsure if reopening that chapter of my life was a good idea, but something in me knew that this was part of moving on. We met at a small cafe, a neutral place that didn't hold any memories. Katherine looked different, happier, more at ease. She'd cut her hair short, and there was a new lightness about her that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her tone genuinely warm. "I've been wanting to do this for a while." We talked about everything and nothing, her new job, my workshops, the places life had taken us since we'd last spoken. There was no tension, no lingering anger, just 2 people acknowledging the past without letting it define the present. "I'm glad you're doing well, Nate," Katherine said as we finished our meal. "I know things were messy and I'm sorry for my part in that, but I'm glad we've both found our way." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. "Yeah, me too. I think we've all grown a lot from this. It wasn't easy, but maybe it was what we needed." We parted with a handshake and a smile, no grand reconciliations or promises of friendship, just a quiet understanding that we were finally at peace with the past. As I walked back to my car, I thought about all the twists and turns that had brought me here. I had spent so long looking for answers outside of myself, trying to make sense of the betrayal, the anger, and the need for control. But in the end, the real journey was always about letting go, not just of Katherine and Jack, but of the person I'd become in the wake of their betrayal. Back at home, I found Allison sitting on the couch flipping through one of her photo albums. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes meeting mine with that familiar, comforting warmth. "How was lunch?" she asked, setting the album aside. Good, I said, sitting beside her. It felt like the last piece of an old puzzle finally falling into place. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase everything that had happened, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Life settled into a new rhythm. Allison and I continued to build our quiet life together, one filled with moments that weren't dramatic but were deeply fulfilling in their simplicity. Weekends were spent exploring the city, discovering hidden coffee shops, and occasionally escaping to the coast where Allison would take photos while I read or simply watched the waves. It was peaceful, and for the first time I felt like I was truly present, no longer haunted by what had been. One evening as we were cooking dinner, Allison looked up from chopping vegetables, her expression curious. "There's something I've been thinking about," she said, her tone light but serious. I glanced at her, setting down the spatula. "What's that?" "I've been offered a job in Seattle," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and hesitation. "It's a great opportunity, working with a magazine that focuses on human interest stories, the kind I've always wanted to do. But it would mean moving." Seattle. It was far enough away to mean starting over yet again. My mind raced, weighing the pros and cons, but I could see how much this meant to her. She had been looking for something like this, a chance to pursue her passion in a new environment. And as much as I had found comfort in our routines, I realized that part of growth meant embracing change, even when it felt uncertain. "That's amazing, Allison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've worked so hard for this. You deserve it." She smiled, but there was a question behind her eyes. "What about us?" I paused, considering my response. "We'll figure it out. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." It was the truth. I wasn't tied to any place, and the idea of leaving behind the ghosts of my past once more was oddly appealing. Seattle represented a new start, untainted by memories of Katherine, Jack, or the chaos that had once consumed me. We spent the next few weeks planning the move. I began winding down my practice, handing off my clients to other therapists I trusted. Dr. Miller was understanding, even encouraging. "Change is good, Nate," he said during our last workshop together. "You've helped a lot of people here, but it sounds like it's time to help yourself." As the days ticked by, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. Seattle was a blank canvas, but it was also another leap into the unknown. Part of me still feared that I'd bring my old baggage with me, that no matter how far I ran, the past would always find a way back in. On our last night in the city, Allison and I went out for a quiet dinner, just the two of us. We reminisced about how far we'd come, from our first tentative conversations to this new chapter we were about to begin. There was a sense of hope, but also a quiet acknowledgement that this move was a test, not just of our relationship, but of the progress we'd both made. The move itself was chaotic but exhilarating. We found a small apartment in a lively part of Seattle, with a view of the mountains in the distance. It wasn't perfect, there were boxes everywhere, and the place still felt more like a temporary landing spot than a home, but it was ours, and that was enough. A few weeks into our new life, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated but answered anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar, and it took me a second to place it. "Nate, it's Jack." His name hit me like a punch to the gut. It had been months since we last spoke, and I had hoped our paths would never cross again. But here he was, intruding into my carefully constructed new life. "What do you want, Jack?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm in town," he said, sounding uncharacteristically subdued. "I'm going through a rough patch, and I thought maybe we could grab a drink, tea talk." There was a pause as I considered my options. Part of me wanted to tell him to get lost, to let the past stay buried where it belonged. But another part of me, the part that had been working so hard on forgiveness, felt a flicker of empathy. I didn't owe Jack anything, but maybe this wasn't about him. Maybe it was about proving to myself that I was truly past everything, that his presence no longer had the power to drag me down. "Fine," I said finally. "One drink." We met at a quiet bar near the waterfront. Jack looked rough, like he'd aged years since our last encounter. He was disheveled, eyes hollow, a shadow of the confident man I once considered my best friend. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. "I wasn't sure you would." I shrugged. "What's going on, Jack?" He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Katherine left," he admitted. "For good this time. She's moved on and I'm stuck. I've messed up everything, Nate. I don't know what to do anymore." I watched him, feeling a strange sense of detachment. There was no satisfaction in his misery, no sense of victory. Just pity. He was a man lost, paying the price for his choices just as I had. "I'm sorry, Jack," I said, and I meant it, but not in the way he might have hoped. I wasn't sorry for him specifically, but for the fact that we had all ended up here, each in our own way broken by the decisions we'd made. He nodded, taking a long sip of his drink. I never wanted things to end up like this. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to see you. To try and make things right. I didn't have any grand words of wisdom for him. There was no neat resolution, no way to untangle the web we'd spun all those months ago. But I'd found my way out, and maybe Jack could too. You need to figure out your own path, Jack, I said finally. I've moved on and you should too. The past is over. It's up to you what you do from here. We parted ways after that, with no promises of staying in touch or rekindling old friendships. It was simply a moment of closure, a final punctuation mark on a chapter that had long since ended. As I walked back to our apartment, the Seattle skyline glowing in the distance, I felt lighter. The ghosts of my past, once so present and overwhelming, were finally starting to fade. I didn't need revenge or validation anymore. I just needed to keep moving forward, one day at a time, with Allison by my side. Back home, Allison was waiting, her camera in hand, ready to capture the sunset from our balcony. She looked up as I walked in, her smile warm and genuine. How was it, she asked, sensing the weight of the encounter. It was what it needed to be, I said, sitting beside her and watching the sun dip below the horizon. I'm done with that part of my life, really done. Allison nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. Good, she said softly, because our story is just getting started. As the last rays of light faded, I knew she was right. This was our new beginning, free from the shadows of what once was. And for the first time, I was ready to embrace it. Seattle felt like home now. The city's moody skies and endless coffee shops had become familiar comforts, a backdrop to the life Allison and I were building together. We'd found our rhythm, her with her photography and me exploring new opportunities in relationship consulting, albeit on a smaller scale. I was selective about my clients, choosing only those who seemed genuinely committed to change. I no longer felt the need to prove myself or take on every case that came my way. Life was good, and for the first time in years I felt content. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One afternoon I was sitting in my small home office, preparing for a virtual session with a couple dealing with trust issues, when my phone buzzed with a message from Allison. It was a photo of a positive pregnancy test followed by a simple message, "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, feeling a rush of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. This wasn't part of the plan. We hadn't even discussed kids seriously. It had always been a vague, maybe someday topic, one we'd skirted around without ever really diving into. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. When I walked into the apartment, Allison was sitting on the couch, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She glanced up, her eyes searching mine for a reaction, any hint of what I might be thinking. "I didn't expect this," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I don't even know how it happened. I mean, we were careful, but here we are." I sat down next to her, still processing. The news was huge and life-altering, and it threw everything into question. Were we ready for this? Could we handle the responsibility of raising a child when we were still figuring out our own lives? "How do you feel about it?" I asked, my voice soft. She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Scared. Excited. I don't know. I've always wanted to be a mom, but I never thought it would happen now. Not like this." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind inside me. This wasn't something we could undo or ignore. It was happening, whether we felt ready or not. And as overwhelming as it was, a part of me felt a strange, unexpected surge of hope. Maybe this was the next step in our story, one that we hadn't seen coming but were meant to take. "I'm scared too," I admitted, reaching for her hand. "But maybe that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just need to figure it out together." Allison squeezed my hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Are you sure, Nate? I don't want you to feel pressured into this." "If it's too much." I shook my head. "It's a lot, but it's not too much. We've been through worse, and we've made it this far. We can do this. We'll figure it out." The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, late-night conversations, and tentative plans. We didn't tell anyone at first. It felt too new, too fragile. But as the reality of the pregnancy set in, so did the excitement. We spent weekends browsing baby stores, half joking about names and debating everything from cribs to strollers. It was surreal, like stepping into someone else's life, but it was also grounding in a way I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, every decision felt more important. Every choice weighed against the future we were about to create. One evening, after an exhausting day of appointments, we sat on the couch, wrapped in a comfortable silence. Allison rested her head on my shoulder, and I could feel the subtle weight of her growing belly against my side. It was still early, barely showing, but it was enough to remind me that everything was changing. "Do you think we're really ready for this?" Allison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought about all the things we'd been through, the betrayals, the heartbreaks, the long road that had brought us to this point. "I don't think anyone's ever really ready," I said honestly. "But I do know that we're better together than we are apart, and that's enough for me." She smiled, her fingers tracing small circles on her stomach. "Me too." We fell into a new routine, one that revolved around preparing for the baby while balancing our own work and the remnants of our old lives. The apartment slowly transformed as we turned the spare room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft shade of green that Allison loved. It was a constant reminder that our lives were about to be forever altered, but it was also a source of comfort, a promise that we were moving forward, building something together. Then one morning, as I was finishing a session with a client, I heard Allison call my name from the other room, her voice panicked. I rushed in to find her clutching her stomach, her face pale and twisted in pain. "Nate, something's wrong," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. We rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest the entire drive. The doctors moved quickly, ushering Allison into a room while I was left waiting outside, helpless and terrified. I paced the hallway, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse finally came out to speak with me. "She's stable," the nurse said, her tone calm but serious. "But there are complications. We're doing everything we can." I nodded, too choked up to respond. When they finally let me in to see Allison, she looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "They said there's a risk of miscarriage," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're not out of the woods yet." We spent the next few days in the hospital, holding our breath with every update, clinging to each small bit of good news. It was a roller coaster of emotions, fear, hope, and everything in between. I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the fear that we might lose the future we were so close to building. But we faced it together, leaning on each other in a way that felt stronger than anything I'd experienced before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctors assured us that things had stabilized. We were sent home with strict instructions for Allison to rest, and for the first time in days I felt a sliver of relief. As we settled back into our apartment, I watched Allison sleep, her breathing slow and steady. I knew we still had a long road ahead, and there were no guarantees, but we were here, and that was enough. For the first time I understood that life wasn't about having all the answers or feeling ready for every twist and turn. It was about showing up, even when things got messy and scary. It was about holding on to the people who mattered, and finding the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what. The weeks following the hospital scare were some of the longest of my life. Allison and I settled into a cautious routine, one dictated by doctor's orders, and the ever-present fear of another complication. She spent most of her days resting on the couch, surrounded by pillows and baby books, while I took on the roles of caretaker, cook, and emotional support. It was exhausting, but it also brought us closer in ways I hadn't expected. We were a team, united against an uncertain future, and for a while that was enough. But as the pregnancy progressed, the weight of everything began to take its toll. Allison's anxiety about the baby's health grew, and with each doctor's visit we held our breath, waiting for the next piece of news that could either keep us hopeful or shatter us completely. It was like living on a tightrope, every step carefully measured to avoid disaster. One afternoon, as Allison napped, I found myself scrolling through my phone, lost in thought. I came across an old photo of Katherine and me from years ago, back when life seemed simple and uncomplicated. She was smiling, her arm wrapped around my shoulder, and I looked happy, genuinely happy in a way that felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. It was strange to think about Katherine after all this time. In some ways I had moved on, but there were still parts of me that hadn't fully healed, parts that still bore the scars of betrayal and regret. I thought about how different my life would have been if none of it had happened, if Katherine had never strayed, and if Jack had never crossed that line. But those were pointless musings, echoes of a past that couldn't be rewritten. I put my phone down and turned my attention back to the present, where Allison was stirring awake. She rubbed her eyes, giving me a sleepy smile as she stretched. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Almost 5, I said. "You slept for a while." She nodded, still half asleep. "I've been having the weirdest dreams lately. Sometimes I wake up and I can't tell if they were real." "Anything good?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. She shrugged. "Mostly just random stuff, but sometimes I dream about us and the baby. Like we're already a family, you know? And then I wake up and it feels like it's all slipping away." I sat down beside her, pulling her close. "It's not slipping away," I reassured her. "We're still here. We're still fighting." She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. I know, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. You won't, I said firmly. We're in this together, no matter what happens. But despite my words, I could feel the cracks beneath the surface. The strain of the pregnancy was affecting us both, and it was becoming harder to pretend that everything was fine. The fear, the stress, the constant uncertainty, it was like a storm we couldn't escape, one that kept circling no matter how hard we tried to stay ahead of it. One evening, after another exhausting day of tiptoeing around our anxieties, Allison suggested we go for a drive. It was something we used to do all the time, just get in the car and go, with no destination in mind. I agreed, hoping the change of scenery might help clear our heads. We drove out of the city, following the winding roads that led to the coast. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, and for a brief moment, it felt like we could leave everything behind. But as we pulled over to watch the waves crash against the shore, the conversation took an unexpected turn. I've been thinking a lot about the future, Allison said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. About what happens if things don't go the way we hope. I tensed, knowing where this was headed. We don't have to talk about that now, I said gently. But we do, she insisted, her voice breaking. I need to know that you'll be okay, no matter what happens. That you won't go back to that place you were in before we met. I stared at her, struggling to find the right words. Allison, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not that person anymore. I want to believe that, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. But you've been through so much, Nate, and I'm scared that if we lose this baby, you'll lose yourself again. Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. She was right. I had been in a dark place before, a place I never wanted to return to. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I was stronger now, that I could handle whatever came our way, there was a part of me that still feared the worst. The thought of losing our child, of watching everything we'd built crumble, was almost too much to bear. I'm scared too, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. But we can't let fear run our lives. We have to keep moving forward, even when it hurts. She nodded, wiping her tears away. I know, I needed to hear you say it. We sat in silence, listening to the sound of the waves and the distant calls of seagulls. It was a fragile peace, but it was ours, and for now, that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I reached for Allison's hand, squeezing it tightly. No matter what happens, I said softly, we'll get through it together. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We didn't have all the answers, but we had each other, and that felt like the only certainty we could hold on to. The days ahead would be challenging, filled with more questions than answers, but I knew that as long as we kept showing up for each other, for ourselves, we'd find a way through the darkness. When we got home, I tucked Allison into bed, watching as she drifted off to sleep. I stayed up a little longer, sitting by the window and staring out at the city lights. I thought about everything that had led us here, all the twists and turns that had brought us to this moment. Life had a funny way of testing us, of pushing us to our limits, but it also had a way of revealing what we were truly capable of. I didn't have a perfect plan for the future, and maybe that was okay. I was learning that life was less about having all the answers, and more about being willing to face the unknown, even when it terrifies you. Allison and I had been through so much already, and no matter what the future holds, I knew we would face it together. For now, that was enough. The weeks drifted by, a blur of cautious optimism and quiet dread. Allison's pregnancy continued without further complications, but the fear never entirely left us. We filled our days with preparations for the baby, decorating the nursery, and attending prenatal classes that offered more reassurance than I'd expected. It felt good to do something practical, something that moved us closer to the life we were trying to build. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the future, the past always seemed to find its way back in. It started innocently enough. I was in my office, sifting through a mountain of paperwork for a couples therapy seminar I'd been asked to guest lecture at. It was a small gig, nothing like the intense workshops I'd run back in New York, but it kept me busy and gave me a chance to apply everything I'd learned. I was deep in the middle of reading about attachment styles when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting a text from Allison or a reminder about some appointment I'd probably forgotten. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. Hey Nate, it's Jack. I'm in Seattle. Can we talk? I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. Jack. The last person I ever expected or wanted to hear from. We hadn't spoken since everything went down in New York, and that was the way I'd preferred it. Seeing his name again felt like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of everything I'd tried so hard to move past. I typed out a dozen responses, deleting each one before I finally settled on a terse reply. What do you want? His response came almost immediately. I just want to talk. I'm in town for a few days, no pressure. No pressure. As if it were that simple. As if the last few years of pain, betrayal, and rebuilding could be undone with a conversation. I considered ignoring him, pretending I hadn't seen the message. But something inside me, a mix of anger and unfinished business, made me type back, "Fine. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Bluebird Cafe." I regretted it as soon as I hit send. I didn't owe Jack anything, least of all my time. But maybe, after all these years, I needed to close this chapter of my life once and for all. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, grabbing a table in the corner where I could see the door. I ordered a coffee I didn't really want and waited, my mind running through every possible scenario. Part of me hoped he wouldn't show, that this would turn out to be just another failed attempt at closure. But Jack walked in, looking older but still unmistakably the same. He spotted me immediately, his expression a mix of hesitation and relief. He approached the table, his hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets. "Nate," he said, offering a small tentative smile. "Thanks for meeting me." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want, Jack?" He sat down, fidgeting with the edge of the table. "I wanted to see you. To talk about everything." "Everything," I repeated, my tone flat. "You think you can just waltz back into my life after all this time and expect me to be ready to talk about everything?" He flinched, looking down at his coffee cup. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did, what Katherine and I did, was unforgivable. I've spent every day since regretting it." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Good, you should." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get it. You hate me, and you have every right to. But I'm not here to make excuses or ask for your forgiveness. I've spent the last few years in therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did. I've lost friends, my job, my marriage, everything. And it's all because I couldn't control myself." I listened, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The anger was still there, but it was tempered by the reality of who Jack had become. A man broken by his own mistakes, desperately seeking redemption in whatever form he could find. "I don't hate you, Jack," I said finally. "But I also don't care about your sob story. You made your choices and they cost us everything. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." He nodded, looking genuinely pained. "I'm trying. That's why I'm here. I needed to say it to your face, to own up to what I did. I hurt you, and I hurt Katherine, and I've been carrying that guilt with me ever since." I stared at him, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make him feel every ounce of the pain he'd caused. But another part of me, the part that had spent years rebuilding my life with Allison, just felt tired. Tired of holding on to the past, tired of letting it dictate my present. "Jack," I said quietly, "I don't need your apology. I've spent too long trying to make sense of what happened between us, and I've realized something. It's not about you. It's about me. I had to learn to let go, to stop letting your choices define who I am." He looked at me, eyes filled with regret. "I know I can't fix what I broke, Nate, but I'm glad you're doing okay. You deserve to be happy." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between us. There was nothing more to say, no neat resolution or perfect words that could change the past. Jack had been my best friend, my brother in every way that mattered, and he'd thrown it all away. But I was done carrying his burdens. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said finally, standing up to leave. "But whatever it is, don't look for it here." Jack nodded, his shoulders slumped. "Take care of yourself, Nate." I walked out of the cafe feeling lighter than I had in years. I didn't forgive Jack, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that I'd faced him, and confronted the ghost that had haunted me for so long. I was free now. Free from the anger, the bitterness, and the endless questions that had plagued me since the day I'd found out the truth. When I got home, Allison was waiting for me, her eyes filled with concern. "How did it go?" I shrugged, sitting down beside her. "It went. He's still the same Jack, just older and more broken." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you okay?" I nodded, pulling her close. "I am, for the first time I really am." As we sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of our shared life, I realized that the past no longer had a hold on me. I had a future worth fighting for, one that didn't involve old betrayals or lingering pain, and for the first time that felt like enough. Life moved forward as it always does, but the meeting with Jack lingered in the back of my mind. Seeing him again had stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried, a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief that the confrontation was finally over. But there was no denying the toll it had taken on me. I found myself more restless at night, lying awake next to Allison, my thoughts drifting back to the past despite my best efforts to stay grounded in the present. I was trying to be the husband Allison needed, the father I wanted to be for our unborn child, but there were still moments when the old doubts crept in. Would I ever be fully free of the shadows that Katherine and Jack had left behind? And more importantly, could I keep those shadows from touching my new life with Allison? One evening, a few weeks after my meeting with Jack, Allison and I attended a birthing class. It was one of those last-minute things squeezed into a busy week, but we were determined to do everything we could to prepare. The class was held in a small community center, filled with nervous couples who looked just as overwhelmed as we were. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Denise, led us through breathing exercises and tips on managing labor pains. It was practical and straightforward, and for the first time in a while I felt a sense of control. I could see it in Allison's face too, her determination to face whatever came our way. At the end of the session, Denise asked each couple to talk about their hopes and fears for the birth. As everyone shared, I listened to stories of past losses, anxieties about the unknown, and quiet hopes for a smooth delivery. When it was our turn, Allison squeezed my hand, nodding for me to speak. "We've been through a lot to get here," I began, my voice steady. "There were times when we weren't sure if this would even be possible, but I guess my biggest hope is that, no matter what happens, we come out of this stronger. Together." Allison smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "I just want our baby to be healthy," she added softly. "And for us to remember that we're in this together, no matter what." After class, we drove home in comfortable silence, holding hands across the center console. The city lights blurred by, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Not perfect, not free of fear, but something close enough to it. When we got home, I helped Allison into bed, making sure she was comfortable before heading to the kitchen to clean up. I was rinsing dishes when my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I dried my hands and checked it, expecting another reminder about the seminar, but what I found was something entirely different. From Katherine Miller, subject, an apology long overdue. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Katherine. It had been years since I'd heard from her, and seeing her name felt like another ghost resurrected. I debated whether to open it or delete it without a second thought, but my curiosity won out. The email was short, just a few lines that carried more weight than she could have known. "Nate, I've thought about reaching out so many times, but I didn't know what to say. What I did was inexcusable, and I've regretted it every day since. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry for everything. I hope you've found happiness, and I wish you nothing but the best. Katherine." I read it twice, letting the words sink in. It was simple, direct, and completely unexpected. For a long time I'd imagined what I would say if I ever had the chance to confront Katherine, to tell her how deeply she'd hurt me. But now, faced with this quiet apology, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a strange emptiness where all those emotions used to live. I closed the email, deciding to leave it unanswered. I didn't need to reopen that chapter of my life, and whatever closure Katherine was seeking, she would have to find it on her own. I had Allison, our baby, and a future that no longer included the people who had once defined me. As I climbed into bed beside Allison, she stirred, her eyes half open. "You okay?" she asked, her voice heavy with sleep. "Yeah," I whispered, pulling her close. "I'm good," she nodded, already drifting back to sleep, and I watched her for a while, marveling at the quiet strength she carried. She was my anchor, my reason for moving forward, and I knew I couldn't afford to let the past drag me down any longer. The following days passed without much fanfare, but there was a subtle shift in how I approached things. I focused on the present, on Allison's needs, the upcoming birth, and the small moments that made up our life together. We continued our preparations, attending doctor's appointments and setting up the nursery. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. One Saturday, while Allison was napping, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I ended up at a nearby park, watching kids play on the swings and couples walk their dogs. I found a bench and sat down, closing my eyes and letting the sounds of laughter and conversation wash over me. It was there, in that quiet moment, that I realized something important. Forgiveness didn't have to be a grand gesture or a conversation. It didn't even have to involve the people who'd wronged me. Forgiveness was a choice I made every day, to let go of the anger, to focus on the life I was building, and to be present for the people who mattered. When I got back home, Allison was in the nursery, folding tiny clothes that looked too perfect to be real. She smiled when she saw me, and I felt that familiar surge of gratitude for everything we'd fought for. "How was your walk?" she asked, setting down a onesie with little bears on it. "It was good," I said, taking her in my arms. "Just needed some fresh air." She leaned into me, her head resting against my chest. "We're almost there, you know? Just a few more weeks." "Yeah," I agreed, feeling the weight of it all in the best way possible. "We're almost there." As I held her, I thought about how far we'd come, from the broken pieces of my past to the fragile, beautiful future we were creating together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time I felt ready to face whatever came next. We stood there for a long time, holding on to each other, and the quiet promise of everything that lay ahead. There would be more challenges and more moments of doubt and fear, but we'd get through them together. And that, I realized, was all the peace I needed. The anticipation of the baby's arrival hung over our lives like a thick electric fog. Allison and I were doing everything we could to prepare, but deep down, we both knew there was no real way to be ready for what was coming. Every kick, every twinge she felt sent us both into overdrive, and every passing day made the reality of our new life feel closer and closer. Then, in the middle of a quiet Sunday afternoon, it happened. Allison was sitting on the couch folding laundry and humming softly to herself. I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the leaky faucet that had been driving me insane for weeks. I had just gotten the water to stop spraying everywhere when I heard a gasp from the living room. "Nate," Allison's voice called out, tinged with a mix of excitement and fear. I rushed over, wiping my hands on my jeans, to find her clutching her belly. I think my water just broke. For a second I just stood there, staring at her like she'd spoken another language. Then the words clicked, and I snapped into action, grabbing the hospital bag we'd packed weeks ago, and fumbling for the car keys. Okay, we've got this," I kept saying, more to myself than to her. Allison nodded, her face calm despite the clear discomfort she was in. She was always stronger than I gave her credit for, and seeing her like that, determined, focused, ready, made me want to be strong too. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. I kept glancing at Allison, who was doing her best to breathe through each contraction, her grip on my hand tightening with every bump in the road. I could see the pain in her eyes, but there was also a look of fierce concentration, like she was already in the zone, ready to bring our baby into the world. We got to the hospital, and everything moved fast, nurses guiding us through the intake, Allison being wheeled into the delivery room, and the flurry of doctors and machines that turned the sterile room into a battlefield. Allison's contractions were coming hard and fast now, each one pulling her deeper into the process, and all I could do was be there, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement that felt painfully inadequate. Time seemed to stretch and compress in equal measure. I lost track of the hours, but I never let go of Allison's hand, even when she squeezed so hard I thought my fingers would break. She was incredible, pushing through every wave of pain, gritting her teeth and refusing to give up even when it seemed like she had nothing left to give. "Almost there, Allison," the doctor said, his voice calm but insistent. "One more big push." I squeezed her hand tighter, leaning in close. "You've got this, babe. Just one more." Allison let out a guttural scream, her whole body tensing as she gave everything she had. And then suddenly, there it was. The unmistakable sound of a baby's first cry, piercing the room and shattering the tension that had hung so heavy in the air. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, squirming bundle that looked impossibly fragile. My heart leaped into my throat, and tears I hadn't realized I was holding back spilled down my cheeks. Allison collapsed back onto the bed, her face drenched in sweat. But when she looked at me, she was smiling, a raw, triumphant smile that said more than words ever could. They placed our daughter on Allison's chest, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The machines, the doctors, the pain, it all disappeared as we stared at the tiny life we'd created. She was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and the most beautiful little face I'd ever seen. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched her soft, wrinkled skin. "She's here," Allison whispered, her voice choked with tears. "We did it." I nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. I'd imagined this day 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared me for the flood of emotions that came crashing down. Love, fear, relief, it all tangled together, leaving me breathless. They took our daughter to clean her up, and I followed, not wanting to be apart from her even for a second. The nurse wrapped her in a soft pink blanket and handed her to me, and I held her close, marveling at how light she felt in my arms. She looked up at me with wide, curious eyes, and in that instant I knew that everything I'd been through, every painful moment, every betrayal had led me to this. "Hi there," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm your dad." The words felt strange and wonderful all at once. I glanced back at Allison, who was watching us with tears streaming down her face, and I knew that we were on the precipice of something entirely new. This was our beginning, a fragile and beautiful start to a chapter that would redefine us both. We spent the next few hours in a haze of exhaustion and joy, taking turns holding our daughter and marveling at every tiny detail, her tiny fingers, her soft cries, the way she seemed to already know exactly who we were. We named her Grace, a nod to the journey that had brought us here, and as the night wore on, I found myself lost in the quiet moments of this new life. Allison drifted off to sleep, and I sat beside her, cradling Grace in my arms. The room was dim, the soft hum of machines the only sound, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt completely at peace. My mind wasn't racing with doubts or regrets. There was no lingering anger or unfinished business. Just this, my wife, my daughter, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. As I rocked Grace gently, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The pain of Katherine's betrayal, the long road of self-discovery, and the unexpected twists that had reshaped my life in ways I could never have predicted. It wasn't a perfect story, and it never would be, but it was mine. And in this quiet, dimly lit room holding the tiny miracle that Allison and I had fought so hard for, I finally felt whole. I kissed Grace's forehead and whispered a promise, one that I intended to keep no matter what. I'm going to be the best dad I can be. I won't let you down. She stirred slightly, her little hand reaching up to grasp my finger, and in that simple touch, I found all the affirmation I needed. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, and I had everything I needed right here. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and the future was still uncertain, but for tonight, this was enough. This was everything. The weeks after Grace's birth were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and a kind of exhaustion I'd never known before. Yet, despite the constant fatigue, I found myself happier than I'd ever been. Every little moment, Grace's tiny yawns, her first hesitant smiles, the way she calmed when I held her, felt like a victory. Allison and I were learning to navigate parenthood together, leaning on each other through every trial, and our bond grew stronger with each passing day. But even in those moments of joy, the past had a way of creeping back in, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I'd catch myself thinking about Katherine and Jack, replaying old memories that I thought I'd buried. I wanted to believe that I'd moved on, but the truth was, their betrayal still lingered in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself alone in the living room with Grace. Allison was upstairs, catching a much-needed nap, and I was cradling our daughter in my arms, rocking her gently as she drifted off to sleep. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the baby monitor, and the occasional rustle of Grace's tiny breaths. It was peaceful, but my mind was restless. As I looked down at Grace, I couldn't help but think about the kind of father I wanted to be, the kind of man I wanted her to see when she looked at me. I wanted to be someone she could rely on, someone who would always be there for her, but there was still a part of me that felt tethered to the pain of the past. And I knew I couldn't be the dad she deserved until I fully let go. That's when I made a decision I hadn't seen coming. I carefully placed Grace in her bassinet, making sure she was secure and peaceful, and grabbed my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I hadn't used in years, Katherine's. My thumb hovered over the call button, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was looking for, closure maybe, or some kind of finality, but I knew I needed to confront this ghost if I was ever going to move on. I pressed call, half hoping she wouldn't answer, but after a few rings her voice came through, tentative and familiar. Hello? I hesitated, feeling a lump form in my throat. It's Nate. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her processing the unexpectedness of it. Nate, I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again. I wasn't sure I'd call, I admitted, my voice low, but I got your email. I've been thinking a lot about everything. Katherine sighed, and I could hear the weight of years in that breath. I meant what I said, Nate. I'm sorry. I've spent so much time regretting what I did, and I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know. I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. They were raw, honest, and maybe the most real thing she'd ever said to me. I know, and I appreciate you saying it. I struggled to find the right words, unsure of what I even wanted to get out of this. I needed to hear it, I guess, but more than that, I needed to tell you that I'm done holding on to it. Katherine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope you've found a way to be happy. I have, I said, glancing over at Grace, who was still sleeping soundly. I have a family now, and I'm trying to be the best dad and husband I can be, but holding on to what happened between us, it's not helping anyone. Not me, not you, and not the people who matter in my life. She sniffled, and I realized she was crying, something I'd never seen her do, not even when everything fell apart. I'm glad you're happy, Nate. You deserve that. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. We both made mistakes, Katherine, and we both have to live with them. But I'm done letting those mistakes define me. I'm ready to move on. There was a long silence, and for the first time it felt like we were both finally letting go. I didn't feel the need to rehash old arguments or demand answers that didn't matter anymore. We'd hurt each other and we'd both paid the price. That was enough. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. For calling, and for saying that. Take care, Katherine, I said, meaning it more than I thought I would, and with that I hung up, feeling lighter than I had in years. I sat back down next to Grace, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. I'd made peace with my past, and for the first time, I felt like I could truly be present in the life I was building. I was done being Nate, the guy who'd been cheated on. I was ready to just be Nate, the husband, the father, the man who'd learned how to let go. When Allison came downstairs later, she found me sitting there, smiling at Grace with tears in my eyes. She sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, and we watched our daughter together, wrapped in a quiet, shared contentment. What's on your mind? She asked softly, sensing the shift in me. Just thinking about how far we've come, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And how grateful I am for you. For us. She smiled, squeezing my hand. We're in this together, remember? I nodded, pulling her closer. Yeah. We are. We sat there until Grace woke, her soft cries pulling us out of our reverie. We took turns soothing her, laughing at the little noises she made, and at that moment, I knew without a doubt that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The weight of the past had finally lifted, and all that remained was the beautiful, imperfect life in front of me. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't have all the answers, but I was here. And for my wife, for my daughter, and for myself, that was enough. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Our lives became a cycle of feedings, diaper changes, and the endless adjustments that come with having a newborn in the house. Allison and I were learning to navigate our roles as parents, stumbling through the sleepless nights with a sense of shared purpose. Grace was growing fast, changing every day, and every new milestone felt like a small miracle. But even as life moved forward, something still nagged at me, a lingering thread that I hadn't pulled on yet. Jack. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the day I found out about the affair. Katherine's apology had been part of closing that chapter, but Jack's absence left a space that I wasn't sure how to fill. I'd avoided thinking about him for a long time, but now that I'd confronted Katherine, I felt a pull to do the same with him. One morning while Allison was out with Grace at a mommy and me class, I found myself pacing the living room, staring at my phone. Jack's number was still saved, buried under old contacts. I didn't know what I would say, but I couldn't ignore the need to reach out any longer. I took a deep breath and dialed. The phone rang a few times, and just when I thought it would go to voicemail, Jack's familiar voice answered, cautious and uncertain. Nate? Yeah, it's me, I said, the tension evident in my voice. I figured it was time we talked. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him bracing himself. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again. I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, I didn't think I'd call either. But things have changed. I've changed. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, there was a heaviness in his voice. I'm sorry, Nate. I know that's not enough, but I am. I was a terrible friend, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I've regretted it every single day. I listened, his words hanging in the air between us like a lifeline that had long since frayed. There was anger there, still simmering beneath the surface. But also something else, a weariness that came from holding on to old wounds for too long. Do you remember when we were kids, how we used to talk about our futures? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. We used to dream about starting businesses together, about living in the same neighborhood and our kids growing up as friends. You were my brother, Jack. And you threw that all away. Jack's breath hitched, and I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. I know. I don't have any excuses, Nate. I was selfish, and I ruined everything. You don't have to believe me, but I hated myself for it. I wanted to yell, to let all the anger and pain pour out, but instead I took a deep breath. You hurt me more than anyone else, Jack. Not just because of what you did, but because you were supposed to be my friend. You were the one person I thought would always have my back. I know, Jack said quietly, and I'll never forgive myself for that. The silence between us felt like an abyss, filled with years of broken trust and unanswered questions. I thought about all the things I could say, all the accusations and recriminations that still bubbled up inside me. But then I thought about Grace, about the kind of man I wanted to be for her. Holding on to this resentment wasn't going to make me better. It wasn't going to change what happened. I'm not calling to forgive you, I finally said, my voice firm but not unkind. I don't know if I ever will, but I need to let this go. For me, for my family. I can't carry this around anymore. Jack's breath shuddered through the line, and for a moment I thought he might break down. I understand. I've thought about reaching out 1,000,000 times, but I figured I'd lost any right to talk to you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Nate. You're right, I cut in, not wanting to let him off the hook too easily. You don't deserve it, but that's not what this is about. It's about me not letting your mistakes dictate my life anymore. I'm moving on, Jack. I've got a wife and a daughter now, and I'm done wasting my energy on the past." Jack was silent, absorbing my words. Finally he spoke, his voice thick with remorse. "I hope you find happiness, Nate. And I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me, even if it's just for your own peace." I nodded to myself, knowing that forgiveness wasn't about letting him off the hook, it was about freeing myself from the weight of what he'd done. Maybe one day, but until then we go our separate ways. "Take care, Nate," Jack said softly, and I could hear the finality in his voice. "You too, Jack," I replied, hanging up the phone and letting out a long, heavy breath. I sat down on the couch, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Confronting Jack hadn't given me the closure I'd imagined, but it had given me something else, a sense of control over my own story. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide how much power I allowed it to have over me. When Allison came home later, she found me deep in thought, staring at Grace's empty swing. She sat down next to me, sensing something had shifted. "What's going on?" she asked gently, placing a hand on my knee. "I called Jack," I said, watching her reaction. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "How did it go?" I shrugged, trying to find the right words. "It was hard, but I needed to do it. I think I needed to tell him I'm moving on, even if I'm not ready to forgive." Allison nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You've come a long way, Nate, and you don't have to have all the answers right now. Just keep moving forward." I smiled, grateful for her steady presence in my life. "That's the plan." We spent the rest of the evening playing with Grace, laughing at her little giggles and marveling at her every expression. In those moments the past felt far away, its hold on me finally loosening. I didn't need to forgive Jack to heal, and I didn't need to forget to move on. All I needed was right here, in the messy, beautiful chaos of my new life. As I put Grace to bed that night, I whispered a silent promise to her. To always be there, to always choose love over anger, and to keep moving forward no matter what. Because in the end it wasn't about erasing the scars, it was about learning to live with them and finding the strength to build something better. And that was a future I could finally embrace. Life had a funny way of moving on, whether you were ready for it or not. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and before I knew it, Grace was starting to babble, taking her first wobbly steps, and transforming into this little person full of curiosity and joy. Watching her grow was like watching a piece of the world come alive, and every day, I found myself more grateful for the life Allison and I had built. I'd left my consulting job behind. The work had served its purpose, but it wasn't who I was anymore. The thrill of manipulating relationships, of bending people's emotions to my will, it all seemed so empty now. I'd spent so much time dissecting other people's lives that I'd nearly forgotten to live my own. So I stepped back, refocused, and started fresh, dedicating myself to being present for Allison and Grace. One crisp fall morning, we were all out in the park. The leaves had turned shades of red, orange, and gold, blanketing the ground in a vibrant carpet. Grace was bundled up in a tiny jacket, toddling ahead of us with all the determination of a kid who'd just discovered her legs could take her places. Allison and I strolled behind her, our hands intertwined, watching as Grace chased after a stray leaf that fluttered across her path. As we walked, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't the dramatic kind, where everything falls into place all at once. It was quieter, more subtle, like the first warm day after a long winter. I'd stopped looking back, stopped trying to make sense of what couldn't be changed. I'd made my peace with Katherine and Jack, and now for the first time I was fully here, in this moment with my family. We found a bench near the playground, and I lifted Grace onto my lap. She squealed with delight, her tiny hands grabbing at my face as she babbled incoherently, trying to tell me some great secret only she knew. I laughed, soaking up the sound of her voice, the sparkle in her eyes and the warmth of the sun on my face. Allison sat beside me, leaning her head on my shoulder. "She's growing up so fast," she said, her voice tinged with that familiar mix of pride and wistfulness. "Yeah, she is," I agreed, watching as Grace's eyes darted around, taking in every little detail of the world around her. "I keep thinking I want to freeze time, keep her this little forever." Allison smiled, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "But then we'd miss out on all the amazing things still to come." I nodded, knowing she was right. There was so much ahead of us. First words, first days of school, scraped knees, birthday parties, and all the little moments that make up a life. I didn't want to miss a single one. As we sat there, I realized that I was no longer Nate, the guy whose wife cheated on him, or Nate, the consultant who manipulated people for a living. I was just Nate, the dad, the husband, the guy who'd learned through all the mess and heartache what it really meant to let go and move on. Grace wiggled in my lap, pointing toward the playground with a determined little grunt. I set her down, and she took off, stumbling toward the swings with a look of pure determination. Allison and I watched her go, our hearts full, knowing that we'd face whatever came next together. Later that evening, as we were getting Grace ready for bed, I found myself thinking about how far we'd come. Allison was reading a story to Grace, her voice soft and soothing, and I stood in the doorway, taking it all in. This was our life now, imperfect, unpredictable, and absolutely beautiful. After Grace was finally asleep, Allison and I sat on the couch sharing a quiet moment. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, and we sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes only after you've been through something together and come out stronger on the other side. "What are you thinking about?" Allison asked, glancing up at me with a curious smile. I shrugged, smiling back. "Just everything. How lucky I am, how grateful I am for you, for Grace." She squeezed my hand. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" "Yeah, we have," I said, my voice soft. "But I wouldn't change a thing, not anymore." Allison leaned in, resting her head against my chest. "Me neither." As I held her, I felt the last remnants of my old life finally drift away. I wasn't defined by the mistakes of others or my own regrets. I was defined by the choices I made today and the people I loved. I had everything I needed right here, and that was more than enough. We turned off the lights, heading upstairs to bed, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. As I lay there, listening to the gentle hum of the baby monitor and Allison's steady breathing beside me, I knew that no matter what, we'd be okay. Because in the end, it wasn't about seeking revenge or holding on to the past. It was about love, resilience, and the courage to keep moving forward, and as long as I had that, I knew I'd always find my way.